when you get a full picture of his life and his day-to-day activities and the way that he just operated, I just don't see how you can believe that he was a self-conscious fraud and con man. Like, the picture that emerges is like a true believer who's flawed like anybody else, flawed like the Apostle Paul was flawed. Actually, he was a lot less flawed than the Apostle Paul.
These are the times we will all remember. Were you there? What did you do? So what do you say? We need to clean this place up?
Thy kingdom come.
Think celestial, making the celestial kingdom your eternal goal.
Listen to me now. Listen to me now.
And he is not permitted to evaluate
innuendo, half-truths, and lies.
Go to some weak sauce, liberal, Democrat, baby butchering church, but do not come back to this one ever again until you repent.
Doubt is a tool of the devil designed to weaken us.
Repent! Repent! Repent!
You are listening to The New Heretics. Shame on you.
Excited to be joined by a noted Mormon apologist today, Emerson Green. How's it going, Emerson?
Good. I was just here smiling Mormonly, watching the sunset. And yeah, I'm happy to be joining you.
Doing the Mormon stare. Is that a thing? So as a witness, we had all of these like kind of urban legends and stuff about Mormons that we believed. I remember hearing there was a whole list of these things. I don't know if you heard similar things. I think you were raised like a Christian of some sort, right?
Yeah, I was raised Protestant. We did not view, I mean, like, if you were really nice and liberal, you thought Catholics were also Christians, maybe technically. But, I mean, Mormonism was just a straight up cult, if it was talked about at all.
Yeah, so same for witnesses. In fact, usually when people talked about Mormons, there would be some reference to the fact that they may have been, like, one of the few religions that was, like, directly started by demons. I think that was a pretty common view that like the salamander and the whole thing that was actually like probably like literally just like a demon. Like maybe Joseph Smith was receiving revelation, but it wasn't from God. And so we used to hear these things like that Mormons think they can like transmit the spirit like through their eyes into you or something, and so they have this like stare. I think that's totally made up. I've looked into a few of these like urban legends over the last year, and it seems like they were all bogus. I remember hearing that like the whatever like the kind of head priest is in the Mormon hierarchy, like if you're like a really like hardcore like fundamentalist Mormon, he would have the right to like consummate the marriage for you, or like really like kind of creepy, disturbing stuff like that I pretty sure is not true.
Yeah, people love to lie about Mormonism. It's really like if you want to learn about Mormonism, I've found that you need to kind of check up on everything that everyone says, because some people knowingly lie about it, but I think once something gets going, it's really hard to like shut it down, because there are just not that many people who are actively defending Mormonism online, and there are just not that many Mormon apologists. Like for the most part, Mormons, I don't think care what we are saying about them, and it's just like there are things that I know for a fact are false that like you can hear Christian apologists say as if they are a fact. But yeah, people say false things about Mormons quite a lot. I've never heard of the Mormon stare though. I assumed you were talking about Mormon face, which is a real phenomenon. Is it?
Yeah. What's that? I'm not familiar with that.
It's just there's a certain sometimes you can just look at someone and tell based on physiognomy that they're Mormon.
That's probably essentially what I'm getting at with the Mormon stare thing. Yeah, it's just more of like we were focused on the eyes more being creepy or something like that. But there's also the kind of like toxic positivity thing that a lot of Mormons I think kind of exude. Although witnesses I think are like that too now in hindsight.
They do. I mean, I think they look
Um,
a certain way, but it's partly because there's like a health code that you have to follow. Like I was on their website a while ago and I found out that like Mormon missionaries, there's like a weight limit. Like there's a certain like weight you cannot exceed if you're going to be a missionary, and they're like really strict health codes too, just for normal members.
Sweet, I would have gotten out of it.
But they also there's like some kind of there's like a smaller gene pool with Mormons. You know, they were. I mean, first of all, there was like a lot of polygamy early on, and it was like a relatively small group of people. So that's one reason I think they kind of look similar. But yeah, I mean, between the health code and their kind of emphasis on like physical and mental fitness and the smaller gene pool. Yeah, I do think that it's true. Sometimes you can just see someone and be like, they have Mormon face. Yeah, it is a real thing.
Yeah. So with your upbringing, just for a little bit about your background, would you consider like, were you raised, I don't know what kind of Protestant denomination, was there any kind of like culty vibe to it? Or was it just kind of more of like a mainline, like Protestant denomination?
It wasn't really culty. It was just, you know, non-denominational. So like if you go to like any mega church with like a light show in it, that's basically, what it was like. And then as I kind of got older, you know, like 15, 16, 17, my parents were getting more and more like charismatic. And then maybe you could say things were getting like cultier, but you know, I didn't see it that way. They're just like taking certain passages like very seriously in the Bible, you know, so like all of a sudden there's like, you know, people are speaking in tongues around me and like laying on hands and healing people. And, you know, to this day, I still hear stories all the time about like people getting healed, you know, miraculously.
Yeah, I had somebody try to faith heal me one time when I was waiting tables. I cut my finger, and I worked with a lot of fundamentalist Christians and evangelicals. And this one woman that I worked with in particular, she was very nice, really sweet person, well intentioned. But I like cut my finger. I'm like bleeding out in the back one night. She comes up and she's like, "In the name of Jesus, be healed," and makes a hand gesture, and finger kept bleeding. But
it didn't work.
I think it was my faith, you know. I probably just
I mean,
harder.
You do have to believe pretty hard in those circumstances, or else it won't work. But it is funny because sometimes they do little magic tricks. Like I remember being at like a small group because my girlfriend at the time was like super into this stuff and her family was into it. So I had to pretend like it wasn't bullshit if I wanted to continue to get laid. So we were like in her living room in like a small group, and then like sometimes they make one leg grow out longer than the other one. So someone will be sitting on the couch and then they'll be like praying in tongues, and then they'll like kind of just grab your leg and like pull it out. So it's like a few inches longer than the other leg. And then everyone's like, wow. It's like, it's literally one of the dumbest things I've ever seen in my life. And it's like a common thing.
Weird. I've never heard of this.
See, like as witnesses, they don't believe in like miracles. So like that whole charismatic, like speaking in tongues and all of that, they're completely like detached from it. And so I think even from like a witness perspective, they'd be skeptical towards miracles. But I think it's just like even like your average folk, like when you tell them about like these like things that can happen, like speaking in tongues or like these you know, faith healings or whatever, I think most people are just like, you know, like, good for you. You know that meme where like thumbs up, it's like
yeah, because I mean I've always felt like if this was really working, first of all, why doesn't it like sort of always work? Why do we still have cancer? I mean, we have 80 million evangelicals in this country. Like, why do any of them get sick with like terminal illnesses and things like that? Like, I don't know. It just doesn't. Yeah, I have a hard time even coming up with a way to try to like steelman this. I mean, I guess maybe just God occasionally performs a miracle to like.
Yeah, it's like if you really believe what you're saying, go to a hospital. And like the thing is, some of them do, and it's sad, but I mean, placebos, like they really do, they do something. And apparently even if you know it's a placebo, it still does something. So yeah, I mean, if you're talking to people who believe, then I don't really want to discourage it, because A, placebos work, and B, it's like you might argue they're giving out false hope, but they're doing something, and they're obviously helpless, and they're trying to do something despite the fact that they're helpless. And like, it's just hard for me to be like, oh, fuck you. It's like,
right.
if someone who you like is sick and there's literally nothing you can do, like that's what prayer is often good for. It like helps you with your helplessness. So it's hard for me to like really resent people for praying, in those circumstances, because it's an impulse of wanting to help, but like they can't, if they could, then they would do something, but they can't. So they pray. So it's like, I don't really hold it against people like I did when I was like, an edgier atheist. And I'm just like, oh, it makes me so angry when people say thoughts and prayers. And I'm just like, they're just trying to be nice, man. Like, right. They're just trying to do something, even though they can't.
I guess with that, because you mentioned how maybe I'm interested in like how maybe you deconverted or deconstructed your faith, how that process went, like how that process was for you, and maybe how that ties into like how Mormonism solves. You mentioned how Mormonism has certain benefits, right? That normal Christianity, in quotes, normal or mainstream Christianity doesn't, because it doesn't have, like, if you're a Mormon, you don't really have to hold the belief of the Trinity. You don't necessarily have to believe creation ex nihilo. So maybe that would be like a good juxtaposition between the two positions.
And just to clarify real quick, just if anybody's not familiar with you or your content, you are not actually Mormon. So.
Yeah.
Okay. I was just about to clarify.
Oh, okay.
Not a Mormon. Yeah, no, I was an atheist, like unambiguously for like 10 years or so. And then now it's like more ambiguous. I'm like kind of an agnostic, but people still think I'm an atheist. They call me an atheist all the time, and I never correct them. Because it's like, close enough. Because if you're like a lacktheist, then I just went from lacking a belief in God to lacking a belief in God. So it's just, I used to have like a very high credence in atheism. I thought it was like, obviously not certain, but it's like God probably doesn't exist. And when I say probably, I mean like I'm somewhere in the 90 something percent sure that there is no God. And then now, mostly due to like alternative conceptions of God, it just feels more ambiguous to me. Like I feel less confident that there's no divine reality of any kind, because the thing I'm most confident about is like particular models of God that happen to be popular in the time and place I'm born. So like if we're talking about classical theism or like some kind of Anselmian God, then I'm still, very confident that God doesn't exist. But then there's something like finite theism, or, like limited models of God, where I don't really know how to deal with that because it's so unfamiliar. So Mormonism, they accept like a finite God, like a God who's limited in power, at least relative to like the superlative omni being of Anselm.
Yeah, can you just unpack that a little bit more? Like, what is their actual belief? Like, who is God in Mormon theology?
Well, God is still the creator of the world, but he didn't create ex nihilo. He created the world out of pre-existing material. So there are certain laws of nature that God just has no control over. So that could help with the problem of evil. But there's like a divide among Mormons. Like some of them have like a more traditional sounding view where God always was God, and you can still become like God. You can go through this process of theosis and enter the celestial kingdom and become like God in almost every way. But there's still this kind of heavenly Father who's, presiding over all of us, like even if we achieve theosis and we're not the exact same as God. Okay, then there are other Mormons, and this has like historically been the more common belief, which is that God is someone who became God, so this was like first expressed clearly in Joseph Smith's King Follett sermon. So this is something that a lot of Mormons believe. It's just not universal. So like the main philosopher, like the best philosopher apologist for the Mormon church, a guy named Blake Ostler, he doesn't subscribe to this view, but still it's extremely common. And historically it's been the dominant view. So God was once a man who went through this process of becoming like God and then had children who can then become like God, who can then have children who can then become like God. And it kind of goes back like that infinitely and forward infinitely. So there's just this infinite regress of people becoming gods and like creating universes and creating people who then become gods and like so on ad infinitum. It's a really trippy view of reality.
Yeah, I mean, that actually resonates with me because one of the issues that I had with Christianity generally, like even as a witness and now as I consider Christianity for myself, is if Jesus was God, it just, I don't know. There's a lot of, it raises a lot of questions for me about like where is the sacrifice? Like, what did he really accomplish? Like if he was already sort of perfect and had some kind of like divine nature, how is that really like a great model for me as like a sinful human? Like I don't know. I just have questions there about like what, and I know that the Trinitarian view is that he was fully man and fully God, but I just like, to me, like the story would be better, in my opinion, if Jesus was like just a normal person who just happened to like be exceptional and then was rewarded by God with this like sort of higher heavenly place, or even like God taking on his form or something like that through the course of his life. I don't know. There's something there that is kind of more interesting to me, just like a normal person who's able to achieve these great things, like not necessarily because he like is God or has like God. I don't know that he's some sort of like, but I don't, again, like Christians might, that may be kind of how they think about Jesus, but I'm not really sure how to make sense out of that with the Trinity. So it seems like the Mormons sort of have a way to just kind of like, it's not as complicated.
Yeah, no, you kind of alluded to the atonement there, and I've actually never even asked what the Mormon view of the atonement is. It's just one of those issues that's like, it's just not that important to me, even though I recognize like in the abstract, it's important. Like what exactly was Jesus's death all about? Like, what did it accomplish? Like what was going on there? It like, that is just not something that frequently occurs to me. I guess partly because I'm so far from actually being a Christian. It feels like that's something you'd have to figure out if you were closer to like, okay, I accept theism and now I'm thinking about Christianity. Like then you'd really care about that. But because I'm like not really even that close to accepting theism, it's like working out the finer points of Christian theology. It just like doesn't really even occur to me to do that. But yeah, it's a good question of just like, what did Jesus's death mean? And if you have different views of the Trinity, like how does that interact with the atonement? I
was going to say because it seems then that the allure maybe behind Mormonism, as you put it, is that it's a position that holds to like a finite, like a limited being, and it's not the same as deism, right? So it's not like, there's certain baggage that comes with a position like deism or deism, however you want to say it. But in a sense, it gives you things that are close to, like, there are certain, maybe there are certain things that it has that are maybe like beneficial for your particular, like maybe philosophical or even intellectual, like commitments. And given those commitments, it has sufficient explanatory power for certain dilemmas or whatever.
Yeah. No, like it's funny because Mormons will sound a lot like atheists when they talk about the problem of evil, because they think they're at least free to think that the problem of evil discredits omnitheism. And when you read Blake Ostler, you will very much see that come through. Like he will write very passionately about the problem of evil because he thinks it is discrediting to omnitheism. So yeah, and then Mormons are plausibly naturalists. And I know that sounds weird, because most people use naturalism, at least in philosophy of religion, they almost use it as like a synonym for atheist. But the thing is, like, they share a lot of beliefs with many atheists. Like, they believe in an eternal universe. They reject, like I said, perfect being theism. And I don't know, like, it's hard to summarize it exactly, but like my friend Joseph Lawal, LDS philosophy, like, he is plausibly more of a naturalist than I am. And he's a Mormon, depending on how you define naturalism. So, it's not as much of a leap, I guess, if you're a naturalist, to like go to Mormonism. And Trent Horn actually mentioned this when he was talking to Jacob Hansen on Thoughtful Faith, where he was describing my view. And he was saying like how he could see how a naturalist could be attracted to Mormonism, because it almost like requires minimal modification of your belief. Like, if you're going from naturalism to theism, this is like the least, like, renovating, I guess, you'd have to do to your worldview. Like, you could kind of believe many of the same things foundationally and still convert.
Yeah, right. Because they're not going to have an issue with evolution, right? They're not going to have an issue with like even like pantheism or like panpsychism or some of these ideas, right? Those could all be compatible.
Yeah, I mean, like, evolution is almost built into their view, because it's like, I mean, apparently some lay Mormons will have an issue with evolution, but just this, they emphasize growth though and change over time. And just like that seems to be a pretty central part of like actually living as a Mormon. It's like this, there's a lot of emphasis on like personal development over time and everything. And like, you're going toward, like, heaven is sort of a place that you get to and you develop to a certain point, which is like not unique to them. I mean, purgatory is supposed to be for developing you to into the type of person who could even be in heaven or something like that.
Islam is really like, isn't like the path, like an important kind of idea in Islam too, like sort of path toward perfection or something like that. Yeah.
But I mean, just to your point about evolution being, being totally fine with LDS theology, it's like, yeah, I mean, I think that's even, you can even see that in their like day-to-day life. But on the panpsychism point, their earliest, I think their first philosopher, Orson Pratt, was a panpsychist. And it, he's like building off things Joseph Smith said. And it does kind of seem like, not that like if you're a Mormon, you should be a panpsychist, but just that Mormonism is almost uniquely well suited to panpsychism. Because they do believe that, well, okay, I don't want to like butcher what their doctrines are exactly, but their beliefs about intelligence and agency and matter, they come together in this kind of weird way that is like uniquely well suited to panpsychism, and in particular panagentialism, which is just panpsychism plus rationality being built into the foundational consciousness as well. So yeah, Mormonism does seem uniquely well suited for that. And their first philosopher, Orson Pratt, was a panpsychist and a panagentialist, and he drew from Mormonism, in part to motivate that.
Yeah, because don't they have like, not like the Mormons, but the thinker that you just brought up, don't they hold to like a sort of like intelligent or like rational matter or something like that? That's like self-organizing,
yes,
and oriented towards. It's like there's not a sense of a strict teleology, but like it's more suited for a auto-emerging teleology or something.
Yeah, no, that's the perfect phrase, rational matter. I think that phrase does pop up. But yeah, they do believe in rational matter,
which is,
and so then they also believe that God is material, right? Mm-hmm. That there isn't like a metaphysical realm or something.
Well, I mean, Mormons are materialists. Like Joseph Smith was clearly some kind of materialist, and Mormon philosophers are typically materialists. But they think that there is something called spirit matter, and it is still matter, but it is like something that they think is, they're not exactly like, like if you plucked a random type identity theorist or something out of the academy, it's not like they'd be in perfect harmony with these Mormon philosophers. So they do mean something slightly different by matter and by material. So yeah, God is made of material, but yeah, it's just they have like this stratified view of materialism where they're like different kinds.
Would it be more apt to say that Mormons are closer to like what would it be, like some sort of like monism or monist position, and that they don't really have a strict sense in this what is it called, like a dualist dichotomy or anything like that? Like there's no like soul or there is a soul or there is like spirit, but it's not that there's like spirit and then there's matter. It's more that these two substances are actually reducible to one substrate or something.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, they're definitely monists, but they just think that there are different kinds of matter, and that like, if you're going to fully explain like a human person, you can't focus on one to the exclusion of the other. If you really want to know about Mormonism, you should probably talk to a Mormon like Joseph. Joseph Lawal is very knowledgeable, and he would know more than I do. I mean, it's funny because I'm constantly having to clarify that I'm not a Mormon when I talk about Mormonism, and I don't mean it as a cop out all the time. Like, but sometimes people will really be like turning the screws. They're like, "How do you explain this?" And I'm like, "I am not a Mormon. I am not like. I don't think that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God. Okay, but I do think there's like some evidence for that. Like, I don't think it's Well, first of all, I think that you can be rational and you can be a Mormon, but that's maybe saying less than it might sound like I'm saying. I think rationality comes pretty cheap. So I think Mormons can be rational in their belief in Mormonism, but there is some evidence that the Book of Mormon didn't just purely come from Joseph Smith's head. Like, you would assume that there's literally no evidence that it was anything other than like his creation, whether he knew what he was doing or not. But no, there actually is a non-zero amount of evidence that he was actually doing what he thought he was doing, which is like supernaturally translating a historical record of things that happened 2,600 years ago or something like that, which is surprising to me as a non-Mormon. I mean, that's not what I would expect. But overall, my credence in Mormonism is still low enough that I'm not a Mormon, but I just don't have like a kind of a caricatured view of it. And, just like how I can admit that there's evidence for Christianity and still sleep at night. It's like, yeah, there's evidence for Mormonism in particular. But yeah, I mean, the reason that I defend them, it's not just because I think that there's some evidence for the Book of Mormon. It's like, no, I think it has philosophical advantages, first of all. And second of all, I just think that they're good people by and large. Like, I think they've created a nice community, like in the unlikely setting of the United States, in the contemporary United States, they've created something where they've got a group of people who are pretty much by every dimension doing better than most other people and most other Christians as well. Like, they're physically healthier, they are mentally healthier, like they literally live longer. They like Jacob Hansen was mentioning some of this in his debate, because he pointed to some of the fruits of Mormonism as some evidence for the Book of Mormon, because the Book of Mormon seems to make people more Christ-like. That's my cat meowing, if that's picking up. But anyway, yeah, she's agreeing with me right now. No, she's a Muslim. She hates what I'm saying right now. But it's just when I see like the never-ending Mormon dogpile and like the customary scorn and ridicule that people throw, it's like at a certain point it just stops being funny to me. Like it honestly seems like everyone's IQ goes down by 20 points whenever Mormonism comes up, and I think it's just like it's a socially acceptable target. And like people just are not thinking clearly about it because it's a socially acceptable target. And I think it has some advantages over other forms of Christianity. And I think that they created something that's pretty cool, which is surprising if Joseph Smith is this evil con man who just made the whole thing up so he could have multiple wives. And I think if someone wants to just implode like the Mormon community, then I would like to know why, because it seems like they made something kind of valuable.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. I think that I think there's a distinction there, because I think there's a difference too between the Christian apologetic who might be going against Mormonism because Arianism, whatever heresy you want to name off. And it's not kosher Christianity, and therefore it must be by default bad. But then there's also what's the warranted criticisms, and I'm sure, like, given that you have no commitment to Mormonism, you would still be like, yeah, like there are probably some practices that they do within the group, like any particular organization or any particular high control group, in which they may like abuse their individuals, their members. But those are like distinct, right? Like we could say, like, this is the philosophical baggage and what it entails, and that may have that may provide good evidence for why the belief is warranted, or at least it's better than mainstream Christianity. And then there's like, oh, I'm actually going to be a Mormon. I'm going to be part of this community, and I'm going to like be an apologist in terms of like their organizational policies. Like, you can be critical about that and not necessarily be critical about the other position.
Yeah. No, there are plenty of critical things to say, but it's like I'm never really tempted to go down that road because everyone else is already doing that. Like, everyone else is already, like, you can't talk about Mormonism for 5 minutes without someone bringing up the Mountain Meadows massacre. Mm-hmm. I don't know, because that is what everyone does all the time whenever Mormonism comes up. It just doesn't. I just don't feel like I'm adding anything or saying anything unique or worth saying. Like, why say anything if you're just going to repeat the same like 10 or 20 talking points that everyone always talks about whenever Mormonism comes up? So that's why I don't do it, but not because they're not valid. It's just, it's already been said a million times.
Yeah. It's easier to always like pile on the criticism than it is to provide like an alternative, or even provide something like oh, this is actually what they do that's positive, or this is actually salvageable, or what have you. So I to the degree that happens a lot in our Twitter circles and even within the ex-Jehovah's Witness community, I that resonates with me.
Yeah, same. I mean, I think really we could go down the line with like other mainstream Christian religions too, right? Like, imagine if every time Catholics came up, like all anybody talked about was like the pedophilia scandal or something. I mean, like, was there a bad pedophilia scandal? Yeah, it's horrible, and it's part of these like institutions that they protect, and they sort of can they can create kind of a safe space for pedophiles to operate, often because of the nature of the way these organizations are structured, and that's a problem. And it's a problem that they've also been addressing. And from what I've seen, I'm not totally convinced that it's a bigger problem in the Catholic Church than it is just in the general public. It seems like, maybe by percentages, it's sort of like to be expected that there's going to be a certain percentage of priests that might be predators or things like that. It may be higher. I'm not totally sure if we have great numbers on that, but the larger point is just that like with any of these like kind of human institutions and organizations, there's going to be these pockets of problems. There's going to be problematic behavior. There's going to be things that have to be cleaned up. But does that mean that we just like sort of latch onto that one sort of criticism and apply that to everybody who's a Catholic, apply it to the entire set of beliefs, it apply to the entire philosophy? We throw out the orphanages, all of the good stuff the Catholics have done all of the hospitals they built, all of the people they have, helped that were impoverished. And this again, like, as somebody who's coming out of a cult, there is kind of a tendency for me to want to do that, to just kind of want to be like, well, there's this one thing I found wrong with your organization or with your beliefs, so like all of it's like wrong, right? And I think part of my maturing process and deconstruction process has just been kind of like what you said, that like, yeah, maybe there is like some evidence that Mormonism is true. Maybe it's not evidence that's convinced me yet. Maybe there's some evidence that Catholicism is true. It's not evidence that's convinced me yet, but like, I don't need to lose sleep over that at night.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting thought experiment of like, okay, what if every time you brought up Catholicism, people laughed and said that, did you know Catholics wear magic amulets? And did you know there was a pope who like slept with prostitutes? And like, that was just like all anyone ever said about it. Like,
Right.
you'd probably feel differently about Catholicism. You know, you're just like, what is going on here? And just if there was some weird contingent set of historical facts where all the weirdness of Catholicism just really struck people, and all the weirdness of Mormonism, they're just like, well, of course. Like, I mean, those strike me as contingent social historical facts that the bizarre shit that's in Catholicism, we're just like, oh yeah, you know, Christianity. And then the stuff that's in Mormonism, we're just like, you know, people laugh at it. I don't really think that, I mean, there are some things I think that it's just obviously a contingency that we view one as like super weird and one as not super weird. Like, I don't really think weirdness is like this property of the beliefs themselves or the doctrines themselves in some cases. Yeah, just on the Catholic pedophilia scandal, though, I mean, I think part of it, I mean, first of all, I'm not sure we do have good numbers because they love to cover it up and then move them around, and then use your tithe money to protect them. And even the cool Pope, the super liberal Pope Francis, he, you know, he also like shelters people in the Vatican. And, you know, it's not just like, because sometimes people bring up the school teacher percentages or whatever. It's like, it's not just about, oh man, every single priest is a pedophile rapist. You know, it's like, I don't think that was ever the point. I think it's that it's a priest. You know, it's like, it's
yeah.
It's someone who you're supposed to trust. It's like a religious leader who like preaches about morals. Like, it's about,
yeah,
it's like,
right.
You know,
the church is supposed to be the paragon of morality, right? Like,
yeah.
So we should be holding them even to a higher standard than the general public, right?
Yeah, and they're like, oh, well, they're not as bad as public school teachers. It's like, oh, right, I forgot that public school teachers and priests and the Pope, these people all have the exact same social role and social function. We should hold them to exactly equivalent standards. Anyway, yeah, it's just, I feel like people like intentionally miss the point about that all the time. Because it is a scandal, and like, it has really, I mean, I think Catholics are, you know, the higher ups, you know, the ones who made all these decisions over the past several decades, like, they are responsible probably more than anyone for the decline in acceptance of organized religion. Because there are a lot of people who believe and they refuse to be a part of organized religion. And like, I know it's hard to, you know, prove things about, if you're talking about like large scale social trends, of course they all have multiple causes and everything. But I'm just saying, like, it's from all the, I just get the sense, and of course I can't prove it, that really damaged people's trust in religious institutions in a way that like hasn't been repaired. And I suspect it's a major force behind, you know, kind of the decline of religion in the educated Western world.
Yeah, bad PR is bad PR.
Yeah, and I mean, Jehovah's Witnesses are having the same problem. There's starting to be a lot coming out online about lawsuits and cover-ups with CSA, and it was the way the organization was set up for decades was really to protect the reputation of the organization. They had this ridiculous 2-witness rule. So like, the only way that the elders would take action when somebody reported sex abuse was if there was 2 witnesses, which there's like never 2 witnesses, right? Like, why would there ever be 2 witnesses? And so it just allowed these guys to like, just kind of in a similar way to the Catholic Church, just sort of like shift around to different places and things like that. So yeah, certainly I totally agree with you. And I didn't obviously mean to, you know,
why do you love pedophile priests? Exactly. That's my question.
Right. It's like not that big of a deal, right? Like, no, but yeah, like just the idea that, of course, like with any group, we could point to scandal, and we could point to disgruntled ex-members who have been treated horribly and legitimately horribly, and there are also institutional abuses here. I mean, I think a lot of people would consider the LDS Church to be a cult. I know a lot of ex-Mormons do. And, you know, they also have, you know, fairly severe shunning practices. They're not nearly as severe as Jehovah's Witnesses, I don't think. but they do practice excommunication, and people can really get like ousted from their community in really harmful ways. And especially if you're growing up in Utah, and you lose that kind of community, that's going to be really tough on you. I would imagine.
No, it's, now I know why my cats were speaking up so much, because I have very little experience with Jehovah's Witnesses, except so I basically have two. Okay. And like, I know almost nothing about your guys' former religion, like other, like it's a very short list of things. So one of the ex-JW people I knew, she had a cat that got pregnant with a bunch of kittens. And then me and my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, like we went to go get a cat, and there were a bunch of them. So we ended up getting two. But the woman who had all these kittens, she was an ex-JW. So that's why my cats are constantly crying out. They're like, please tell the story. So, and like, she was telling me how, she didn't really even deconvert. I don't think she was an atheist or anything, but she like disagreed with a bunch of like, Jehovah's Witness teachings or something. And she was shunned, like she like had spoken to her mom once in the past like few years or something. And there was like no end in sight. And then, I remember looking something up one time to, like kind of confirm that was a practice. And then on the website, they were kind of denying it was even a thing. And then I was like, well, I know it's a thing. I met someone who was being shunned. And then, so that was one experience I had with JWs. And then the other one was in high school. There was a girl who was in my school who was popular, to put it politely. And like there was mainly like she was a friend of mine, but she had this boyfriend, and then they broke up. So I thought now was my chance. And then but there was this other third guy who she seemed to like more, and it seemed like I was losing the battle there. So then I basically did, but then he told her he couldn't be in a relationship with her because he was a Jehovah's Witness and he needed to focus on his pursuit of the ultimate friendship with God. And then she was like, what the fuck? And then just like, so that was the end of it.
Yep.
So then I got to date her after that. So a very positive experiences overall.
Yeah. So you love Jehovah's Witnesses. Yeah.
Yeah. I got two great cats, and I got a girlfriend in high school because, so, I mean, sounds good to me. I don't know what you're
win-win. Yeah. Sweet.
And now, for reasons known only to the poet himself, a heretical haiku by Nick Barron.
1 wife, 2 wives, 3. LDS Chads be breeding. Theodicy keys. Witnesses also have some interesting solutions to some of the kind of more mainline Christian problems that you see Mormons having some answers to. Like witnesses reject the Trinity. For one thing, they just think Jesus is God's son, just in like kind of a more literal sense, that he was the first thing that God created, but that he is part of creation. So they still hold him in high esteem. They would still consider him to be like the king of God's kingdom, but they see that as like a subordinate position to God ultimately. He's basically been delegated a bunch of responsibilities by God. And they also do, reject hell outright. They just believe that when people die, it's like an annihilationist belief. They do believe in a resurrection, but for most people, that's going to be a resurrection on the earth. And so this is probably the main selling point for witness theology, the kind of foot in the door for most people that convert, is just the idea that you can live forever on the earth and that your dead loved ones and stuff will be resurrected and live with you on the earth again, and that the earth was going to be restored to like something like Garden of Eden like conditions, that was the original like idea for the earth, and that God's going to get it back to that we're sort of on this detour. The other kind of what I think is kind of an interesting idea, I think there's problems with it, but their answer for the reason that there is so much suffering in the world is that we are basically doing an experiment of rulership. And maybe other Protestant denominations teach something like this, I'm not sure, but the idea is that like when Adam and Eve sinned, they were basically saying we want the right to rule ourselves, and Satan sort of puts that in their ear, and they go along with it. And so when they eat from the tree, they're saying like, we don't want to follow your laws. Essentially, we want to set our own laws. We want to govern ourselves. And so God is allowing this 6,000 year plus experiment in governance to show humans and other intelligent beings that they do not have the ability or the right to govern themselves. So that's why he allows all of the horrible things that are happening, because it's sort of like it's an experiment that has to run its course. And when it's done, it'll be done forever, and he will undo all of the pain and suffering and damage and stuff that was caused. But yeah.
Okay. So the fawn dies in the forest and it's still our fault somehow.
Right.
I never get the fall theodicies, because it's like, even if you want to say, well, God is handing us the reins, or, if you want to say like, well, it's because there was the fall in the Garden of Eden and that's why there's pain and suffering. It's like, okay, but still there's some switch that was flipped at some point that created flesh-eating bacteria.
Right.
Why? Like, I mean,
why do we have baby cancer? Right.
Well, yeah, I mean, like it just saying, oh, well, human free will and the fall, like that does not explain most of the evil.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to.
Yeah, it can sort of account for like governmental. It sort of accounts for like, why do we have war or something? Why do we have like genocide and these kinds of like larger structural problems? But yeah, like why do we have disease? Like why did we need disease to do this experiment in rulership? Like,
or why do animals suffer in nature? Like why? Yeah.
Like that actually almost seems counterproductive to the experiment. Like, if you really just want to see if humans can rule themselves, why are you adding in all these other variables? Like, oh, let's also give you cancer, and like let's also make it so that like I don't know, whatever like other types of suffering we want to talk about. Mosquitoes need to exist,
Yeah.
That was funny, Nick. You once mentioned the strongest argument against God is the fact that mosquitoes exist.
That's my favorite.
I was going to mention because the problem, or the term that's sometimes used in philosophy of religion, is gratuitous evil, and I know that that's how Jehovah's Witnesses try to, account for that, but it really doesn't, because it's still animal suffering. People get cancer. Tree falls, crushes the fox's leg, and it dies a horrible death. Like, that still doesn't explain why that type of evil exists. Maybe you know, maybe you don't know, Emerson, but what would you say would be the strongest argument for Mormons, for Mormonism, in terms of the position? How does it explain gratuitous evil, or account for it, so that there's no such thing as gratuitous evil?
Well, it's tricky, because I feel like their best asset is going to be their model of God, where he creates the world out of pre-existing material. There are laws of nature that he didn't create. There's nothing he can do about it. It's either this or nothing. But it is really hard to come up with some kind of principled model of God where he can still do all the miraculous things that Christians want him to do, like occasionally intervene and, perform miracles or help Joseph Smith translate this language that he doesn't speak or something. there are things that Christians typically believe that God does or has done, like intervening in history. And that's kind of hard to square with, okay, God could do that, but he also couldn't lower the amount of child starvation by like even one child. Like he couldn't like prevent even one fawn who's like burned in a forest fire, or like in the like Australian wildfires a few years ago. He couldn't prevent even like one koala from not being horribly burned and dying in agony. Like every single one of the so it's just a very weird kind of power that God has, and like these limitations are very strange. Like it's hard to come up with a non-ad hoc principled model of power where you kind of get this result, so that's a huge difficulty. But still, despite that difficulty, it seems like a pretty good answer if you say, well, why doesn't God prevent this? Well, he can't. I mean, like if you think that, if you think it's like getting mad at your earthly father for, not preventing you falling and scraping your knee, or like not preventing the Holocaust or something, it's like that would make no sense because he couldn't do those things. Like he couldn't prevent you from suffering in the ways that you've suffered or that other people have suffered. Limiting God's power is a huge asset because now you don't have to try to justify suffering purely morally, where you say, oh, there's actually some reason that this happened. It's because of soul building or because free will, or something like that. Because if God can do anything, it has to be kind of a moral explanation, of why there's suffering. But if you limit God's power, then you can have kind of like a logistical explanations, for lack of a better term, where it's like, look, you just can't do that. There are laws of nature in place that God has nothing to do with, and he tries to help you navigate them, but he can't change them. And that's why we don't live in the best of all possible worlds, the best world you could conceive of. If there is such a world, you can at least conceive of a world much better than this one. But yeah, it's not that I think that Mormons like successfully, just undermine all of the force of the problem of evil. I mean, like the main reason I'm not a Mormon is the reason I'm not a theist, and the main reason I'm not a theist is because of the problem of evil. But I do still think that finite theism diminishes that, which is kind of why I say I'm more of an agnostic these days, because I think that it is that big of a deal, I guess, to dispense with the Anselmian unlimited superlative mega being, that most Christians believe in. If you limit God's power, that's a huge deal. And that really, really helps. The main difficulty is coming up with some kind of principled non-ad hoc model of God's power, such that you get all the results you want as a religious Christian who, so like Philip Goff recently came out as a Christian, as a heretical Christian, and the way he gets around it is by basically just denying that God ever does any of the things that Christians normally think he does. So like there's no virgin birth, as far as I can tell. There's like no miracles. So he just takes like this radically liberal position on a ton of issues in order to maintain finite theism, because he sees that as like the only way to really to really answer the problem of evil in a satisfying way. So that's one thing you could do. But I don't know, for me, it's like, why be a Christian if you don't like really believe any of the doctrines? Like, I don't know if he's changed all that much from his like previous Christian fictionalist state,
Yeah, it seems like you could just hold like a I don't know, like a variation, like a non-theological, like Gnosticism, right? Like where it's like the demiurge created some sort of demiurge or maximally strong God. Just all it did was create the world. It's non-deistic, meaning that you can still have your matter and whatever. Like you can have your intelligent matter if that's the sufficient being that you need for your particular position, and then you're not inherently tied to all this like cultural Christianity baggage, which that has its own implications, like associations and all that.
Really, Philip should be a Mormon because he believes in rational matter. He believes in a finite God.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's the one who coined the term panagentialism. The like panpsychist theory of rational matter.
I can't imagine he believes in eternal hellfire.
No, he doesn't. Yeah, exactly. I mean, like it really should be a nice fit. And I think that if Mormonism were more well established and less of a joke, then he would see that like he's kind of independently, secularly like reinventing Mormon theology, but because it's just viewed as such a joke, it's like, it's just off the table. And that's, I mean, honestly, that if I could change something about the way people view Mormonism, that would basically be it. Like just to have them view it as another denomination, like the same way they view, like Wesleyan Christians or something. It's like, oh, it's just some denomination I don't know much about, as opposed to viewing it as like this total joke, is obviously fake religion. It's not obviously fake. I mean, again, you have to employ like clear double standards, blatant double standards to actually think that like, Christianity, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense, but Mormonism is just ridiculous. It's like, no, they kind of stand or fall together. I mean, like, not exactly, because the Book of Mormon is a separate thing, but I'm saying like for the most part, they stand or fall together. Okay. Like atheists have a consistent position on this. They think they're both ridiculous. Okay. Like, but yeah, the only really inconsistent position here, I think, is saying that one of them is probably true and super rational, and the other one is just ridiculous, and you're a moron if you take it seriously.
Speaking of double standards, Capturing Christianity put out a video where he went through 15 reasons why Islam and Mormonism are fake. And
you're not referring to the video about how witches can't cast their spells on Donald Trump because he's protected?
I mean, we could get to that.
He's at the cutting edge of content creation right now.
The intellectual side of Christianity.
So I thought we could go through a couple of these just to show, not that we're taking particularly seriously, but just to show the kind of double standard that gets applied to Mormonism. And it's just such an obvious, like, there's such an obvious blind spot, I think, that somebody like this is showing to their own beliefs. Yeah, let's just start with this first one. The phantom prophecy problem.
The idea is that both Muhammad and Smith claimed that prophecies from earlier scriptures foretold their coming. But, and this is key, you can't actually find these prophecies because, conveniently, they've been lost from the original sources. But don't worry, because both prophets claim that God re-revealed these lost prophecies about them back to them. A lot of Mormons don't even know this, but Joseph Smith did the exact same thing. He claimed he was foretold in Genesis 50:33, a verse that shows up nowhere in any ancient manuscript, not in the Masoretic text, the Septuagint, nor the Dead Sea Scrolls. In fact, this verse was completely absent from every known source until Smith conveniently added it to his Joseph Smith translation of the Bible. The so-called prophecy also shows up in the Book of Mormon in 2 Nephi chapter 3, where it states that a seer named Joseph, just like Smith, would be raised up in the latter days. But just as with Muhammad, there's absolutely no historical evidence for the existence of verse 33 in Genesis 50. Chapter 50 has always ended, as you can see here, in verse 26. No Jewish scholars, no Christian writers, no early church fathers, no pagan historians mention an extended version of Genesis 50. It simply does not exist. All right, let's shift gears and talk about how these stories actually compare with Jesus. Christianity does not rely on lost prophecies. Jesus' coming was foretold openly and clearly all over the Hebrew scriptures, with centuries of verifiable prophecy leading up to his birth, life, death, and resurrection. Just read Isaiah, who prophesied the birth of a servant who would be called Mighty God and Prince of Peace, who was despised and rejected, pierced for our transgressions, and who was raised and lifted up. In Christianity, there are no claims at all of lost texts or concealed verses. Everything is out in the open. The prophecies about Jesus are transparent and traceable. That's what sets Christianity apart from these other religions. Jesus didn't need to create a myth about lost prophecies. His entire life was an open fulfillment of the real prophecies found in earlier manuscripts of the Hebrew scriptures.
I'm kind of confused that he said that's the main problem. If you watch nothing else, watch this problem. I'm kind of like, I was waiting for the punch, like waiting for like this is, I mean, so what? Like, I don't see how that really counts as any evidence against their view at all.
I don't either. I mean, I can think of a few examples just from the Bible, like to show some double standard. I mean, like there's references to like the books of Adam in the Old Testament. We don't have the books of Adam, and apparently, at least there's some claim that those were used to compile like the early records of like Genesis and things like that, but we don't have those texts. There's the Q source that scholars are pretty universally agreed upon that we don't have, that Mark is basing his writing on. So I'm not, just like I don't see how there's some huge issue here with like lost text. I mean, I think the Bible is probably filled with holes, and things were plugged up and pieces were added and things are missing.
Yeah, I'm kind of failing to see what the big problem is. Like, even if you just say like, okay, they reference a text, and if you want to say they're like self-conscious frauds, you can say, oh, they're knowingly referencing a text that no one can see conveniently. It's like, yeah, that is convenient. How is this like some kind of debunking of Mormonism? Like, I was expecting like, I don't know, an anachronism or something, or like something that would, point to the Book of Mormon being solely produced by the imagination of Joseph Smith, as opposed to, well, he referenced a text that we don't have, and we don't think it even exists. Okay, right. I mean, like, but do you know for sure that it doesn't exist? I mean, like, even again, let's just assume that Joseph Smith was like a self-conscious fraud and con man. Okay, there's a reason he referenced a text that you can't disprove the existence of, and that you can't check. Okay, so like just saying, well, I can't check the text to confirm or disconfirm what he's saying. How the hell is that some kind of like knockout punch for Mormonism?
Right.
I don't know what you're talking about, dude. Like I actually expected like something that, if true, would be like a good argument against Mormonism. Like I said, I was expecting like an anachronism or something like, oh, well, premise one, we would expect to see ancient ruins, in Central America where this supposedly took place. Premise two, we don't find ancient ruins, therefore Mormonism is false, or something. But like, he references a text that we don't have, and there's a chance just doesn't even exist. Okay, well, I mean, unless you want to prove that it doesn't exist, which you can't. I mean, again, even on the assumption that Joseph Smith is like a straight up con man, it's like there's a design to this lie, so that you can't do what you're trying to do right now. Like, Joseph Smith is not a complete moron. Like, anyway, it's just, even if you think of him as a total con man, it's like, okay, but he's lying in a way so you can't disprove him. So this wouldn't be some kind of big old problem for his view. So what are you doing? Like, what are you talking about?
Well, and Mormonism doesn't hold to biblical inerrancy. Right, like he's already kind of presupposing that, I think, right? Like, because as far as I understand, Mormons will say that the Bible is God's word insofar as we have, that it's been translated correctly, and that we have the full text, and we have accurate accountings of the text and things like that. So they don't even need to. Yeah, they don't like a Mormon doesn't have an issue with a missing verse in the Bible or something like that. They don't see the Bible as compiled by, the Orthodox Church as being like this infallible, inerrant document.
Yeah, no, they definitely don't view the Bible as inerrant, and I don't think they would. I mean, obviously they believe in like progressive revelation and all that, so I don't see. I mean, was that the point he was trying to make? Like, so you say there's this missing part of Genesis, but you also say that the Bible is without errors of any kind.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that would be an argument, but I don't think that's what they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if anything, the fact that the fact that the Bible, if we would take, let's by the assumption there that the Bible is like corrupted or the Bible is incomplete, and we have accounts. So, like you guys said, we have evidence, we have historical. Empirical evidence that the Bible has been distorted, or that the Bible is incomplete, or that the way that it was canonized is to exclude certain documents. isn't that credence for the argument in the first place? Like, wouldn't it be not just convenient, but wouldn't it just be like, oh yeah, like they would take out the part where it prophesizes someone to come, yet to come, and discredits our particular religion. This is like non-evidential. Like this isn't anything.
Yeah, it's weirdly nothing. Like it's weirdly insubstantial, I guess, is how I'm feeling. Because like he's really building up to it. Like if you watch no other part of this video, watch this part. And like,
yeah, he starts with it. Yeah, he says it's the knockout punch, right? It get worse from here, by the way.
Oh boy.
Yeah, let's skip a couple. They're all bad, but let's do this one next.
Joseph Smith drew heavily from the literature and folklore of his time in crafting the Book of Mormon. Scholars have documented striking parallels between the Book of Mormon and contemporary works, suggesting that Smith was far more influenced by 19th century American culture than by divine revelation. One key example is Ethan Smith's 1823 book, View of the Hebrews, which sort of speculated that Native Americans were descended from the lost tribes of Israel. This idea strongly resembles the narrative of the Lamanites in the Book of Mormon, who are described as a people descended from ancient Israelites who migrated to the Americas. Additionally, the names and terms used in the Book of Mormon show clear signs of influence from other contemporary sources. So, for example, the name Nephi, one of the main figures in the Book of Mormon, has no known roots in ancient Hebrew or in any other ancient language, but it does appear in popular travel literature of the time. The Travels of Marco Polo, a well-known book in Joseph Smith's day, included a reference to Nephi, a name for a region in Arabia. Another example is the name Mormon itself, which might have been inspired by Mormo, a mythical figure mentioned in The Wonders of Nature, a book that was widely circulated in the early 19th century. In contrast, Christianity maintained its consistency with the Hebrew scriptures, and the idea of incorporating pagan elements would have been morally repugnant to the Jews of that time.
That's insane. I mean, first,
literally
like
insane.
The idea that Christians weren't influenced by Neoplatonists,
I know,
or like the idea that like, dude, the Apostle Paul is like almost quoting the people who he's speaking to, where he says like, you know, in him we live and move and have our being. Isn't that like from Stoics or something? Like I feel like I remember reading about how Paul like directly. Yeah, like wasn't he directly quoting the people he was trying to appeal to, like their pre-existing like kind of pagan beliefs or whatever? Like I know that there's some passage. I mean, I wish I had it in front of me, but yeah, I know that Christianity was influenced by oh gee, I don't know. Let's see here. Was St. Thomas Aquinas influenced by Aristotle in any way?
Right.
Like, good God. But yeah, just the idea that Aristotelians and Platonists had no influence over Christians or over the Apostle Paul and the stuff he wrote in the New Testament. That's crazy. But yeah, just like saying that there are like names in the Book of Mormon. This is what a stupid can of worms to open, dude, because like the Book of Mormon, that is like one of the few lines of evidence that supports the Book of Mormon. Like there are 337 names. This is fresh in my memory. 337 proper names in the Book of Mormon, but none of them have the letters Q, X, or W. And those letters don't appear in ancient Hebrew. So like, there's no way that Joseph Smith could have known that. He was like, he wasn't illiterate, but like he wasn't a big reader. Okay. He was like an uneducated, like farm boy who like came from a super poor family. And like, I mean, according to his mom, he was like the least educated of her children. I mean, he knew the Bible, but like, that's about it. And I don't think you'd pick up just by reading, you know, the Bible that like, oh yeah, in ancient Hebrew, there's no Q, X, or W. So like in the Book of Mormon, which I'm making up, when I give 337 proper names, make sure not to use those letters. Like, okay, that's some like literary evidence for the Book of Mormon. Like, I mean, you can just believe that Joseph Smith is the luckiest guesser of all time, and he just luckily never used any of those letters. But like, just bringing up names, specifically names, in the Book of Mormon as like evidence against Mormonism is just bizarre. That's like one of the few pieces of evidence for the Book of Mormon. Is like, yeah, that thing about the proper names, but also just undiscovered names in the Book of Mormon, there are like a dozen Hebrew names that sound like literal gibberish, at least to me. And it sound like I would have just assumed that, like, yeah, Joseph Smith is just making up Hebrew sounding gibberish. But in the past century, they've all been independently verified, usually by non-Mormon scholars. Like, oh yeah, that was a real name. So there were a dozen undiscovered Hebrew names in the Book of Mormon. And we didn't know they were real names until like decades after Joseph Smith died. Okay, so I mean, that combined with the thing about the proper names, it's like, look, man, the Book of Mormon is a, like, what, 500 or 600 pages? Like, he was writing thousands of words a day, or like translating thousands of words a day for a couple of months. And that's where this whole book comes from. And just the idea that he, like, just by chance, he just made up a bunch of like Hebrew sounding gibberish. Oh, and it turns out that, like, those are all real names that we didn't know about until decades after this guy died. Oh, and when you gave, those 337 proper names, you luckily, just by chance, never used letters that don't appear in the ancient Hebrew alphabet. Like, why would Cameron bring up names, Hebrew names of the Book of Mormon? Like, wow, devastating evidence against Mormonism, because I proved that there's a similar book, there's a similar name, Mormo, which is kind of like Mormon. That's in a book that we don't know that Joseph Smith read. He like didn't own it or anything, but like it existed at the time. Maybe he did read it, and maybe he added the, N, and then that's how he got the name Mormon. Like, okay, what's more compelling? The stupid shit that Cameron just said, or like what I just mentioned about the proper names and about the dozen undiscovered names? Like, it just seems like, how could an objective person seriously think that this is like a serious problem for Mormonism as opposed to evidence for the Book of Mormon?
Yeah, this strikes me as the same associative type of like loose thinking that, like, it's almost like conspiracy level thinking, at least in its like formality, where it's like, oh, 9/11 and like the Simpsons predicted it, and like therefore we have compelling evidence that they're part of this like media cabal where like all the people at the top, they know what's going on, and they planned the 9/11 attacks, and the Simpsons were just giving us these subliminal messages. It's like, just because these things are related or even loosely correlated has nothing. That's not even an argument. You're just showing us pretty basic associative level thinking.
Yeah, I think you're being unfair to 9/11 truthers.
That's right.
No, it's just like, just saying, well, the names in the Book of Mormon are actually evidence against Joseph Smith. Plus, just look at the similar name that was in a pamphlet that at least existed at the same time as Joseph Smith.
Guys, the cross was a popular religious symbol long before Christianity. Like, I'm not going to say that they took the cross, like from pagan religions necessarily, but I mean, there's so much stuff that's intertwined with culture and religion. Like, how are you going to unpack Roman history, Roman culture, and the early church? Like, where even the architecture and things that the early churches are built with, right? This is coming out of a specific culture and time, in the same way that Mormonism is developing at a very specific culture and time in America. It's part of, this early like revival that's happening, this like sort of evangelical revival in the 1800s. There's a lot of apocalyptic thinking. There's a lot of kind of fear about like sort of where industrialization is heading and things like that. And so, yeah, like it's going to be, kind of a product of its time. Some of their beliefs are going to reflect the culture that it's in. That's not an argument against it. I mean, if that's an argument against Mormonism, it's an argument against Christianity.
Well, I mean, now that you say that, it actually helped me realize just how bad this argument was, because why wouldn't God allow Joseph Smith's own understanding to, have any influence over the church that he's founding? Like, if he's God's chosen prophet, maybe there's some reason for that. Like, maybe there's something about Joseph Smith that maybe he didn't just, do eeny, meeny, miny, mo and land on Joseph Smith. Like, maybe there was some reason. So, I mean, just the idea that like Joseph Smith's understanding is influencing, like the history of the Mormon church or, the text or something. It's like, why is that a problem? Especially if you have a more, what do you call it? Like a catalyst view of translation, which seems to me to be the more defensible view, as opposed to like a mechanistic view of translation, where Joseph Smith is just literally like looking at a word and then saying the word that he's translating. I mean, like, by his own admission, he didn't speak the language that the plates were in. Okay, like it was always a kind of supernatural, semi-revelatory, like he wasn't even looking at the plates for like huge swaths of the translation process. So like whatever was going on was obviously not just like a standard normal mechanical translation where you're just like going through words and like, you know, translating them. Like it was some kind of revelatory process. And if you believe it, then it was done with like, you know, God's supernatural, miraculous intervention. You know, it wasn't just a normal translation. So anyway, if you take the catalyst view, then it doesn't even seem like a problem. And I think that the catalyst view even has support as early as like Brigham Young, who said that if Joseph translated the plates again, it wouldn't be in the same exact words. Like it wouldn't be like a word for word copy. So it's like, you know, he gets some inspiration from what he's reading, but it's like partly a revelation from God or something. Anyway, it's just, if you have that kind of view, which is a pretty mainstream view as early as the second president of the church, then I don't really see how it's that big of a deal if some of Joseph Smith is like in the text, you know, as long as it still is ultimately what it purports to be, which is a record of what happened in the Americas, like, you know, a couple thousand years ago. I mean, that's what the Book of Mormon says it is. So as long as it's still that, then like, if it's partly a revelation from God and like the catalyst view is correct, then like this is a non-problem.
Like, does Cameron really think that like the Bible writers didn't bring in any of their own personality or any of their own cultural baggage?
What is his view of the Bible? Like God is whispering in their ear word for word what to write. Like,
right.
I'm sure some of the Apostle Paul is in his letters, but it's still, you know, inspired scripture.
Yeah, I mean, Paul will say stuff like, "This is my opinion." Like, I think maybe God's like backing this idea, but like, this is pretty much me. You know, this is how I feel about something. Like, he'll say things like that. He'll say, just clearly there's different like styles to these writers too. You know, Luke, by tradition was like a doctor. He gives a lot more detail about things like the miracles. Like he gives a little bit more medical detail about like the conditions people have and things like that. As opposed to like Matthew, who's in his gospel, he's really focused on appealing to Jews in particular. So he's like constantly pointing back to prophecies that Jesus supposedly fulfilled. So I mean, there's like, my understanding is like, this is I don't even, like, from a Christian perspective, I feel like you should believe and like think that this is a good thing, that the Bible has these different human authors that are bringing in their own human experiences and like their own cultural kind of, I guess, baggage, for lack of a better word, their cultural like biases to some extent, and that God is just sort of like guiding it. It's not like they're transcribing for a businessman or something like that.
You were like backing yourself into a really hard to defend view of inspiration if you take what Cameron is saying to its logical conclusion, where like God is basically divinely dictating what's going to be in the Bible. Like, that is very hard to defend because there are errors in the Bible,
right?
You know, among other things. But, you know, and I know Cameron doesn't have that view, so I don't even know what he's talking about here, where it's like, oh, it's a huge problem that parts of Joseph Smith are in there. And oh my God, like I almost had to walk out of the room when he said View of the Hebrews by Ethan Smith. It's like, dude, where are you getting this from? Like an anti-Mormon pamphlet from like 1890 or something? Like, this is the most like tired, worn out bullshit. Like, I can't believe it. Mormon apologists beg you to read View of the Hebrews. First of all, because it's the most boring book imaginable, but second of all, because the parallels are laughable. Like, the idea that this was like plagiarized in order to write the Book of Mormon is a joke. It is not defensible. Okay, so like, anyway, it's just, he's reading like just gutter level surface, you know, anti-Mormon apologists and then just repeating it. Like, I don't understand how you can actually think the Book of Mormon is plagiarized or something like that from View of the Hebrews. If you want to just reference View of the Hebrews and say, oh, some of these ideas were in the air. That's like a subtly different point you're making. But like, it sounded like he was saying something stronger. I'd have to go back and maybe he chose his words carefully and he was trying to say like, well, there's a similar kind of idea in View of the Hebrews with the lost tribes of Israel or something like that. But first of all, you have to look at what the Book of Mormon actually says versus how it was interpreted. That's something you constantly are running into. It's something I ran into early on, is like, you think that Mormonism has more or less been discredited because you're conflating things that are in the Book of Mormon with things that people have believed about the Book of Mormon, including Smith himself. So like, the Book of Mormon never says all kinds of things that early Mormons believe, because they were just interpreting the text a certain way. Okay, but it's like, it would sort of be like me insisting that the Bible says the earth is 6,000 years old. And it's like, look, Ken Ham interprets it that way. It's like, yeah, he does. Lots of Christians interpret the text that way, but you do have to separate what the text actually says and how people interpret it. So like, Joseph Smith and many early Mormons believe that a lot of this stuff happened in the heartland, like in North America, whereas like contemporary Mormon scholars, it's like a near unanimous consensus that it happened in Central America. I mean, like, just because it was interpreted one way doesn't, and the Book of Mormon never says whether it's in North or Central or South America, so if you're like trying to discredit the Book of Mormon, you should pay attention to what it actually says and not just what other people have said about it. Like, I used to think Mormonism was discredited because, oh, hey, look at this genetic evidence. The Native Americans are descended from Asians primarily, not Hebrews, not Middle Easterners. But, the Book of Mormon says they're descended from Middle Easterners. No, it doesn't. Like, I mean, that is what some probably all early Mormons believed. That like, oh, you see those Native Americans, like, well, they're actually descended from Middle Easterners who came over here, all of them. And like, yeah, genetics has discredited utterly the idea that all of the Native Americans are like Middle Easterners or something like that. Like, obviously that is not tenable.
Yeah. And if that's our standard, Cameron, like for like 300 years, like half of all Christians didn't believe the Trinity. So like, are we?
he might deny that though. I have seen plenty of Christians just like, again, say completely batshit insane, indefensible things about what early Christians believe. Would it surprise you to know it is exactly what some Christians in the United States in the 21st century believe?
How about, do you want to do one more quick one?
Yeah, sure.
This one's just even worse. We're getting worse as we go along.
Do the worst one.
I think this might be of the ones I saw. I don't think I even watched them all. This is just
Christianity has no influences from paganism is pretty wild.
It's wild. Yeah. I mean, we didn't even get into Yahweh and a lot of the scholarship there that, seems to indicate that he was just originally part of a pantheon of Near Eastern gods. I mean,
yeah, henotheism and all that.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I should probably clarify what the argument is here since we're not starting at the beginning. Private revelations are a problem, apparently.
Oh.
Took his retreat to a grove of trees where he claimed to have a face-to-face meeting with God the Father and Jesus Christ. And what did they tell him? Well, apparently they informed him that all existing churches were wrong and that he had to restore the true faith. Again, this earth-shattering revelation also happened in private. So in both of these cases, these prophets emerged from their private retreats as the exclusive bearers of God's message. Now let's contrast this with Jesus Christ. Did he have to retreat to a cave or like a secluded grove to receive his revelations? No. Jesus did the exact opposite. His entire ministry was public, surrounded by thousands of witnesses. His teachings were delivered to crowds. His miracles performed in full view of anyone watching, and his resurrection was witnessed by hundreds of people, including his enemies. The truth claims of Christianity are not based on like secretive private revelations in a cave or in a forest. They're rooted in verifiable public events where people saw, heard, and experienced the works of Jesus in real time.
Wow. That is You're right. That I hope that's the worst one. If there are any that are worse, I don't think I could handle it. But just saying, like, Joseph Smith had a private revelation. Jesus, on the other hand, preached in public. It's like, yeah, Joseph Smith also preached in public. What are you talking about?
Right.
They're just saying, like, he said, "Oh, let's."
Do you remember when all of the Israelites went with Moses up to receive the 10 Commandments?
Hey, you remember when everyone saw Paul's vision of Jesus on the road to Damascus? Right. That wasn't a private vision in any way, shape, or form. Yeah, but it. Oh, God damn! It's just like, wow. Private revelation. It's just there were every time he said something, I thought that was going to be the worst of it, and there were like 10 things that I wanted to like. I almost needed to start taking notes. But yeah, just saying like, okay, I was thinking of the Apostle Paul right away. But yeah, Moses is another good example. Of like coming back with some mysterious tablets after leaving for a while.
Like, hundreds saw
his hair blown back.
The resurrection. I'm like, bro, no one saw the resurrection.
Yeah. Oh my God, that was another point.
The two eyewitnesses, alleged eyewitnesses.
Yeah. And we don't even know that those eyewitnesses. We can't really say for sure what it is they experienced, right? Like. So Paul has this revelation of Jesus on the road to Damascus. I mean, what was that? Like, even if I don't even necessarily need to deny that he didn't have an experience, but like he doesn't describe seeing Jesus like in the flesh. He just has like an experience of some sort.
Hundreds of
it sounds like a vision.
Hundreds of accounts of people, like even modern day, is saying that they experience private revelation. And that is an account of them experiencing God, and therefore that gives credulence to their faith. Like this would discredit everyone that holds to any sort of like modern day interventionalism.
Yeah, I mean, anyone who wants to appeal to religious experience as evidence of any kind. I mean, like I'm not totally clear on what his argument even is here. It's just that Jesus did things in public. And never in private? Like, I don't know. It's just the idea, like contrasting Jesus and Joseph Smith. Like, well, look, Jesus's ministry is public and Joseph Smith's ministry is not public. I mean, you're just talking about like a private revelation that Smith had at one point. And I just don't know what that is supposed to prove. Like Jesus never had private revelations. I don't know. He probably did. But yeah, just hundreds of eyewitnesses. Did you guys know this? That there were hundreds of eyewitnesses to the resurrection? Because that's fucking news to me. I did not know there were hundreds of eyewitnesses. I thought there were like 2 and then the Apostle Paul. Yeah, like that's what Trent Horn said in his debate with Jacob Hansen. There were maybe 2 and then the Apostle Paul.
To be charitable, probably what he has in mind is Paul saying that there are 5. He says something like there are 500 among us who saw Jesus, resurrected or something.
Oh, well, if one guy says hundreds of people saw it, that's the same thing as hundreds of, independent eyewitness reports.
And unlike with Joseph Smith, where we actually do have like signed testimony from people who claim to have seen some of the work that he was doing, we have no evidence. We have no testimony. We have no names even of any of these 500 people that supposedly saw Jesus after he was resurrected.
Yeah, anonymous secondhand eyewitnesses. Wow, what spectacular evidence, as opposed to 19 firsthand eyewitnesses to the golden plates who suffered persecution, who were, they had personal beef with Joseph Smith. They had every reason to recant and they never did. Blatant double standard when it comes to eyewitness testimony there. And
for all we know, even with those 500, I mean, because we don't have their testimony, we don't know what they mean by they saw Jesus. I mean, that could have literally just been like they had a meeting, and felt the Holy Spirit or something. It doesn't necessarily mean that each of them had like some kind of physical, like material interaction with Jesus. And in fact, in a number of cases, the Bible talks about people not recognizing the person that they think is Jesus. So it's even possible that like they were just sort of getting a vibe from, they really wanted to believe that Jesus had been resurrected, or that there was, some greater kind of plan at work or something. And then they started projecting that onto situations or whatever. We don't have enough, detail for him to be acting like Christianity doesn't have this problem.
That's such an interesting.
It requires a leap of faith.
Yeah, I mean that detail. I always forget about that detail. That, like some people didn't recognize him, and it's like, how do you square that with like? I mean, if Cameron Bertuzzi died, like someone just like murders Cameron, and then or like one of these witches cast a spell, and he's not as protected as Trump, you know, so like he ends up dying, and then like we hear about him dying, and then like this guy like with this face and this haircut and these glasses like knocks on my door. I'm not going to be like, who the fuck are you? I'm going to be like, that's Cameron Bertuzzi.
Back from the dead to haunt me.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I had another train of thought, but you made me laugh and I forgot. Absurd.
I think the thing is, you know, he made all of these points about, you know, all this evidence, in quotes, evidence. But isn't this the guy that converted to Catholicism because of like some Excel spreadsheet that was an attempt at Bayesian analysis or something?
Oh yeah, there's like a 98.725% chance that Jesus was resurrected. In case you guys haven't heard.
Oh man.
What are you, a math denier?
I'm like, yeah, totally, man. Like, whatever floats your boat, Cameron. God totally is like, yeah, you know what? This Cameron guy gets to go to heaven because he was the only one that believed 98.72%. You know, after that Ethiopian kid that was starving.
Yeah, I mean, it does. I do get the feeling from Cameron and from other Christian apologists who are more into the like philosophy of religion space that they often just kind of weaponize philosophy to make their position look good. And it's not really about like just searching for the truth wherever it may lead. Like when you're making a spreadsheet, you know, and it's like, well, here's the very specific probability of Jesus's resurrection or whatever. It seems more like you're weaponizing Bayesian epistemology as opposed to like actually using it in any kind of honest or rigorous way. But yeah, I just, that's kind of a pet peeve of mine is when people figure out like how to make normal atheist apologists kind of look dumb by appealing to philosophy of religion. But like, it's just weaponized. They just beat them over the head with it. It's not because they're actually like curious about philosophy or anything.
Yeah, I agree. I think we live in the unfortunately we live in the age of breadtube, and so like you said, you gotta make ends meet however you can, and I think with the whole new atheist movement, there's a hard reaction towards whatever the hell this is, and I think we're barely now moving in the position where I think some people are kind of seeing past the grift, but I think that's my hopeful or wishful thinking.
Yeah, we'll see. It's weird because like the way things, you know, like new atheism came about in a very particular set of conditions. And it's like, obviously we're in a very different set of conditions now. So the same thing just sounds totally like bizarre and cringy. But I'm pretty sure it felt really good to be a new atheist in the specific like evangelical dominated culture. Like it kind of seems like they had it coming, honestly. Like it kind of seems like the culture deserved the new atheists. And,
I was in college at the time, like when the Iraq War was really going, like mid 2000s, and I was in a really evangelical city in Colorado Springs where there's a ton of
publishing capital of the country, I think, for Christian books.
Yeah, there's a ton of like evangelical headquarters there for all sorts of nonprofits and like focus on the families there and stuff. So I was just like soaked in it, and so in that context, right, like Hitchens and some of these guys were like a breath of fresh air almost, even as a witness for me at the time. I remember watching some of this stuff and like, you know, I couldn't laugh, I couldn't accept his arguments, but there was something that kept me like drawn to it. You know, it was like, oh, this is refreshing just to hear somebody calling out so much of this bullshit. And then also, you know, all of the sort of critique of Islam, which then, you know, there was an obvious reason for that at the time, and then that just sort of like dovetailed into critiques of just like all sort of religious fundamentalism broadly. And so it didn't seem cringe, but like now when I hear Sam Harris talk about Islam, I'm like, you sound like a genocidal freak or something. Like, I don't even know, like it's a completely different kind of context they're working in now, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Because I used to love Sam Harris. I used to really get into listening to his stuff, and then
I don't hate him, by the way. I'm just like kind of saying emotionally. Like sometimes now he just like sort of triggers me with some of the.
Oh yeah, no, I find him like unlistenable now.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
I haven't listened to his podcast in years, but that's kind of when he switched to being like a CNN level pundit, like just talking about politics all day. But I don't know. Like even the stuff that I liked, there are, I don't know. There are still things I like about all the new atheists, like I wouldn't say they're all like irredeemable or something. It's just, if you like philosophy of religion, then you're going to be endlessly frustrated by their arguments and their like debate performances. But for the most part, they were like reacting against a social and cultural and political, kind of Christianity and Islam that they, I think, rightly opposed, and they treated it with the respect it deserved. And a lot of people, but they cast like a wider net, and people criticize them fairly. I'm not really, I'm way out of my new atheist phase, but I just think it served a purpose, and like things are different now because of the new atheists. And if, they might have even elevated the conversation in a certain way, because when Christian apologists were reacting against them, if you wanted to explain why they were wrong, you kind of had to do at least a little bit of philosophy of religion. And I just think listening to atheists criticize them and listening to Christians criticize them, it kind of did help me go deeper into philosophy of religion in a way that I might not have if I didn't first get really attached to the new atheists. And then some people say, oh, hey, they're actually wrong about this, that, and the other thing. And I'd say, well, what do you mean? And then anyway, because I went from like Christian apologetics into like philosophy of religion, like first I was interested in apologetics, and then it was philosophy of religion later. So, really, I have the new atheists and Frank Turek and all these people to thank for kind of in a roundabout way getting me into philosophy.
Well, yeah, maybe let's just wrap it up. Thank you. You've been so generous with your time. I really appreciate it.
It's been fun. No, thank you guys for having me on. It's been a good time.
Maybe just to wrap it up with this. None of us are Mormons, though. Why is that? I mean, and not to say that, this isn't necessarily like to get into like what's wrong with Mormonism, but just sort of what are we finding unconvincing? Like why have we all not committed to Mormonism? And we've done a pretty good job here of steelmanning, I think, their worldview and showing that, it's maybe should be taken more seriously as just a viable sort of Christian alternative. But what kind of baggage do you carry if you accept Mormonism?
Well, the best argument against theism is like some form of the problem of evil. And I think that also applies to Mormonism. So, I mean, you say I'm not a Mormon. The real answer is not yet. I'm not a Mormon. There's still time.
Right.
But I think that
for all of us,
to see the light.
Yeah.
But even if not, it's not like we're going to burn for all of eternity. We're just missing out on how good things could be in the afterlife.
We just have to be in first heaven. I think.
Yeah, there's the terrestrial, the celestial, and then the celestial, and that's the one where you get to be God of your own universe.
You just won't get a planet, you guys. I mean, like, what's the worst thing that can happen? You just don't get a planet.
I mean, I almost feel like a Pascal's wager here. It's almost kind of worth it to just have the possibility of having your own planet, isn't it?
That would be like the best afterlife, truly.
Yeah.
But even Joseph Smith said that even the lowest kingdom of heaven, it's so good, if you knew how good it was, you'd kill yourself to get there. So, I mean, you're not coming out too bad no matter what. But yeah, I mean, I guess for me, it's the main problem with Mormonism is theism. And, I think that evil is really great evidence against theism, even if you try to, do this Hail Mary pass of finite theism. And, I think some of the standard arguments for atheism actually do pack a punch, like evil in particular. Hiddenness is another one. And, I don't know. I don't know. I've never tried to apply Graham Oppy's argument from naturalism to the Mormon tradition. That's something that's really cool about finite theism, is like it's actually not really talked about that much in the literature right now, like in philosophy of religion. And it's unclear how some of the things that people have talked about would actually interact with finite theism. So just like almost out of curiosity, I want Mormonism to be taken more seriously. But yeah, I mean, for me, just speaking only for myself, the main problem with Mormonism is theism. But things specific to Mormonism, I don't know. I'm not bothered by some of the things that people point to. Like, I don't really think polygamy is like absolutely wrong in all circumstances. Like, oh, it's just a moral fact of the universe that like polygamy is intrinsically impermissible or something. Like, obviously you can imagine situations where it's abusive and coercive. But I don't think it's like wrong, like causing suffering for fun is wrong. What else do people say? They talk about the character of Joseph Smith. That never really does anything for me. I mean, like, Paul was like a murderer. He like went around murdering religious minorities.
Mm-hmm.
Joseph Smith's crime is that he was horny or something. But
archaeology.
Okay, archaeology. That's a good one. So like, archaeology is difficult for me too, unfortunately, because archaeology, like, so people will talk about horses. You know, they'll say like, well, what, you know, the Book of Mormon will talk about horses and chariots or whatever. And I found out that there's actually no archaeological evidence for horses in regions occupied by the Huns, and they lived in a society that was dependent on horses.
Interesting.
Or, you know, so there are just things that I don't know anything about archaeology, so everything I learn about it is somewhat surprising. But, you know, people, like I mentioned, the genetic evidence earlier. And it's like, well, Mormons, I mean, the Book of Mormon doesn't say that all Native Americans are descended from, you know, Middle Easterners. Just straight up doesn't say that. So like the DNA evidence does, or you might say, well, why isn't there some trace DNA evidence, you know, of Middle Eastern DNA in Native Americans? And it's like, well, we know for a fact that, this is another thing I've heard from Mormon apologists. Like, we know for a fact that Romans lived in ancient Britain, but there is no genetic evidence that Romans were in ancient Britain. Like, we know because of other evidence that they were there for sure, but any genetic trace of them is gone. Okay, so it's not at all beyond the realm of possibility that that the genetic evidence just wouldn't really be there, that the archaeological evidence wouldn't be there. Because keep in mind, like, all the events in the Book of Mormon take place in a region that's about 500 miles by 200 miles. That's not a huge area, and we don't know where it was. Like, just on the Book of Mormon's own terms. So just saying like, oh, where's the archaeological evidence for this stuff? It just never really did it for me, because we've only excavated, like, I think it's something like 0.5% of the ground in the Americas. So, I mean, this would be like looking at a forest with 100 trees in it, and I say, you know, there are squirrels in those trees, and you look at half of one tree and say, no, there aren't. You know, so I mean, until we know more about archaeology and history in the Americas, I just don't think you can say for sure that, we know that this didn't happen. We absolutely don't know it didn't happen. So, I mean,
one of the hangups. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I don't want to ramble on, but it's like some of the things that people point to, they don't bother me that much. Mm-hmm. Like, the anachronisms, I think, are slightly different. So, like, there are anachronisms that are genuinely anachronistic. Okay. But like, one thing, if I'm putting my Mormon apologist hat on, I would point out that, you know, if you were to collect all these anachronisms at the time the Book of Mormon was published, there would be, like 100 or 200 of them. And as time has gone on, as people have discovered things about history and about archaeology, the number of anachronisms has not increased. It's decreased. Like, the Book of Mormon has actually been vindicated on many of these points. And if you look at a book of anachronisms from like 50 years ago or like 75 years ago, it's way outdated. Like, there are plenty of things that were viewed as anachronisms that in fact were not anachronistic. And that is the general trend. We have this big pool of anachronisms and they're disappearing. Okay. It's not growing. But there are still plenty of anachronisms that remain. And even the best Mormon apologists, like Robert Boylan, for example, will readily admit there are anachronisms, but they're okay with that because of the general trend of anachronisms going away and not piling up. And they have, you know, other reasons to think Mormonism is true, like religious experience, you know, just like the overall weight of the evidence. So I guess for me, the thing that's going to push me away from Mormonism in the end is theism. But there are anachronisms, like, genuinely. And there are just certain points in Joseph Smith's story that, like, no one can deny. Like, boy, it sure is convenient. Like, it sure is convenient that you got this revelation about how you have to take multiple wives and it's okay for you to have sex with them or something. Like, there are plenty of things in Joseph Smith's story that are convenient for him. Like when he lost the first 116 pages of the Book of Mormon, he was commanded by the angel. The angel was like, you can't translate the same plates. You've got to translate this other version. There's like, it's the same story told from it, like how there are different books in the Bible that tell the same story. It's like, you got to do that basically, because I'm so angry that you lost these plates. It's like, that's convenient. Now, I think that Mormon apologists have responses to this that are not totally implausible. But I'm just saying there are several points at which the Mormon story sure is convenient for Joseph Smith, who I just can't believe at the end of the day it was a self-conscious fraud. I think he was a true believer. And part of that is because I don't have a superficial understanding of Joseph Smith and Mormon history. I've been reading this biography of him called Rough Stone Rolling. It's generally regarded as the best biography of him. And I'm saying when you get a full picture of his life and his day-to-day activities and the way that he just operated, I just don't see how you can believe that he was a self-conscious fraud and con man. The picture that emerges is a true believer who's flawed like anybody else, flawed like the Apostle Paul was flawed. Actually, he was a lot less flawed than the Apostle Paul. But still, I just don't think he was a fraud. I don't think that's a good explanation. And I'm actually not alone among skeptics who take that view. I just think the fuller picture of history doesn't lend support to the fraud/con man model. I guess one thing I would point to, if people are watching this on YouTube or listening to a podcast, something you can turn to that I thought was really interesting was the debate between Jacob Hansen and Trent Horn that happened on Pints with Aquinas. That was a really good debate. And also a debate between two friends of mine, Dustin Crummett and Joseph Lawal, LDS philosophy. They're both philosophers, and there was a lot of interesting stuff. Joseph doesn't think that these kind of historical issues are really a good criteria for really good criteria for any religious person to support or detract from their religious worldview. He's more of an experience-based kind of believer. So I thought that was a great debate, and I thought the Jacob Hansen debate was great as well. So I guess I would just point people towards those if they want to hear more. Oh, and of course, I have many things about Mormonism on my own channel. Well, thank you for having me on, and thank you for letting me ramble there. No. But I really do appreciate it, and I had a good time.
He's been Emerson Green, polygamist and Mormon apologist.
Elder Green.